Montana Territory, September 1881. The wind kicked up dust across the dry road leading out of Fort Benton, and Naomi Whitlow held her baby tighter to her chest as the town behind her turned its back for good. "You ain't welcome here no more," the preacher's wife had hissed not an hour ago, her lip curled like Naomi was something foul. "You made your bed. Now lie in it somewhere else." Naomi hadn't bothered to answer. Words would not change their minds. Not the townsfolk who once nodded politely when she passed. Not the shopkeeper who now refused her credit. And certainly not the man who had promised her forever and left the moment her belly grew round. Now, with nothing but a sack of clothes and her daughter swaddled in a worn blanket, Naomi walked east down the rutted trail, not knowing where it led. Nellie stirred in her arms, her tiny fist brushing Naomi's chin. "I will not let you go hungry," Naomi whispered against her daughter's forehead. Her voice cracked. "I do not care what I have to do." By midday, her boots were slick with mud and her skirts clung to her legs. The sun bore down merciless. She stumbled once, caught herself, and kept moving. She had to. There was no choice. A mile or so farther, her legs gave way. She sank to her knees on the side of the trail, shielding Nellie with her body as the wind picked up again. Her vision blurred. She had not eaten since yesterday morning. "Hey!" The voice startled her. A man on horseback pulled up a few yards ahead. He wore a wide-brimmed hat and a dust-streaked coat, a rifle slung across his back. His horse, a chestnut mare, shifted beneath him but stayed calm. "Are you hurt?" he asked. Naomi could not speak. She only shook her head and adjusted Nellie in her arms. The man dismounted. He moved slowly, like someone used to skittish animals. As he stepped closer, she saw his eyes were a clear gray-blue and his face was sun-worn but kind. "My name's Thatcher Vane," he said, crouching a few feet away. "I've got water. Food, too. You want some?" Naomi blinked at him, throat too dry to answer. Nellie let out a soft, hungry cry. Thatcher pulled a canteen from his saddlebag and offered it without stepping too close. "You look like you need rest. My place is just over that ridge." She hesitated. "I ain't gonna hurt you. You have my word." Naomi looked down at Nellie, then back at the man. Her legs trembled underneath her, and her arms were weak. There was no choice. She nodded once. He helped her stand carefully. She had to lean on him to stay upright, and for the first time in weeks, she felt something solid beneath her hand. Thatcher lifted her onto his horse like she weighed nothing, then handed her the canteen. "You ride. I'll walk." They made it to his land just as the sun began to dip behind the hills. His cabin sat in a shallow valley, modest but well-built, with smoke curling from the chimney and chickens pecking in the yard. A fenced pasture held 2 cows and a mule. Naomi looked around, dazed. "You live here alone?" Thatcher nodded. "Built it myself. Used to ride with cattle herds down Texas way. Got tired of always moving." He opened the cabin door and motioned her inside. "You can rest here tonight. Let the little one sleep." She stepped in slowly. The cabin was warm and clean. A cot sat near the hearth and a pot of stew simmered over the fire. A small table and 2 chairs stood beneath the window. It smelled like cedar and something savory. Thatcher handed her a bowl and poured water into a tin cup. "You eat. I'll tend the horse." Naomi sat on the cot, holding Nellie close while spooning stew into her mouth with trembling hands. The baby dozed, warm and full. Naomi's own eyes burned, but she refused to cry. "Not here. Not yet." When Thatcher came back in, she was already asleep, her hands still on the baby's back. He stood there a moment, watching her. Then he pulled a blanket over both mother and child before settling himself on the wooden floor across the room. The next morning, Naomi awoke to the smell of coffee and the sound of wood being chopped outside. Nellie was nestled beside her, cheeks pink from sleep. She sat up slowly, unsure what to do next. She had thought only of surviving the night, not the day after. Thatcher came in an hour later, carrying firewood. He nodded to her, his face unreadable. "There's eggs if you want them. You and the little one can stay as long as you need." "Why?" she asked, her voice still hoarse. "You do not even know me." He looked at her then, really looked. "I saw a woman alone on the road, starved and half dead with a baby in her arms. That was enough. Naomi lowered her eyes. They cast me out. I figured. Nellie's father he left when I told him I was carrying. The preacher's wife called me a disgrace. Said I led him astray. Thatcher's jaw tensed, but he said nothing. I do not want charity. He stepped forward, his voice quiet. Then do not take it as that. I have more work than I can handle. You want to earn your keep, you can. But you and that child deserve a roof and a fire. That is all I'm offering. Naomi looked up at him slowly. All right. Days passed. Then a week. Naomi helped with meals, gathered eggs, washed clothes by the creek. She carved out a place in the rhythm of Thatcher's days. Nellie grew stronger, her cheeks rounder. She gurgled when Thatcher held her. His big, calloused hands careful and sure. He had never once asked about Naomi's past again. One evening after supper, they sat on the porch as the sun dipped behind the ridge. Nellie slept inside, wrapped in the same blanket Naomi had carried her in. I do not know how to thank you, Naomi said, her voice soft. Thatcher looked forward, his elbows on his knees. You do not need to. You saved us. He turned his head, then met her eyes with something quieter in his. I think maybe you saved me too. Naomi did not know what to say to that, but she noticed, for the first time, how close they sat, and how her heart did not feel so heavy anymore. The first frost came early that year. Naomi gathered the last of the turnips from Thatcher's small plot while Nellie slept in a basket lined with wool by the hearth. Her fingers ached from the cold, but she moved steadily, brushing dirt from each root and stacking them in a burlap sack. Thatcher returned from the ridge with a brace of grouse slung over his shoulder. He set them on the chopping block and wiped his hands on his trousers. Snow'll come before the month's out, he said, glancing up at the pale sky. I've never known a season to turn so quick, Naomi answered, folding the sack closed. Where I grew up, autumn lingered longer. He nodded, then tilted his head. Where was that? Near Hannibal, Missouri side of the river. She hadn't spoken of it since arriving, but the question didn't feel like an intrusion. Just a man wanting to know. My father worked the docks, took cargo downriver to St. Louis. He drowned one winter when I was 16. Ice caught the hull. Thatcher didn't speak, but his gaze stayed steady on her face. I kept house for my mother after that, she added. She never remarried, said no man could fill what was lost. He ran a hand across the back of his neck. That's a hard way to grow up. It taught me to be still when I'd rather run. She straightened her back and looked toward the cabin where Nellie's soft cries began to stir. And to keep quiet when I'd rather scream. Thatcher walked with her to the door. You don't have to do that here. That night, Naomi sat on the floor by the fire, mending one of Thatcher's shirts while Nellie dozed with her thumb tucked under her chin. The only sound in the room was the quiet scrape of the needle and the low hiss of wood settling in the flame. I've been thinking, Thatcher said after a while, leaning back in his chair. I could build another room before the freeze. If you're set on staying. She paused, the thread pulled tight in her fingers. You want me to? He looked over at her, brow furrowed. You reckon I'd offer if I didn't? I don't know what kind of man you are yet. Thatcher gave a small nod like he respected the answer. Fair enough. She threaded the needle again, not looking up. If I stay, I'd want to work for my share. I'm not looking to be beholden. You already pull more than your weight. Still, I want it understood. Thatcher stood and crossed to the hearth, lifting the kettle. Understood. Naomi watched the steam curl up from his cup, then turned back to her stitching. You don't ask many questions. I figure if something's worth knowing, it'll come out in time. That how you've lived all these years? He looked at her over his shoulder. It's how I've stayed whole. The days shortened. Naomi split kindling while Thatcher repaired the barn roof. She kept a running list of what they'd need before the first snowfall: flour, lamp oil, more wool for Nellie's wraps. They would have to go into town, and the thought turned her stomach. She held it in until the night before they were to leave. I don't expect anyone there will welcome me, she said quietly as they sat by the fire. Some of them knew me from before. Thatcher poured 2 cups of tea and handed her one. I'll be with you. That won't stop the looks. No, he said, sitting beside her on the floor. But you won't be standing alone. She stared into her cup, steam brushing her cheek. I used to think if I kept my head down, people would leave me be. They don't. No, her voice caught. They don't. She felt his hand brush hers once, light as breath. He didn't press it, just let it be. The next morning, Naomi wrapped Nellie close and climbed into the wagon beside Thatcher. The path into town was rough, the wheels rattling over dry ruts. They passed a pair of hunters on the trail, and one of them tipped his hat to Thatcher, then eyed Naomi and the child without saying a word. She felt the heat rise in her chest but said nothing. The general store was crowded. She kept her back straight, eyes forward. Thatcher moved beside her with quiet confidence, pulling down sacks of grain and checking the stitching on winter boots for the baby. No one said anything outright, but the silence around them felt thick, like a held breath. At the counter, the shopkeeper glanced at Naomi, then at Thatcher. You paying for all this? Yes. He didn't even pause. The man scratched down the total and took the coins Thatcher laid out. Storm's coming next week. You'll want to move the livestock down into the lower shelter. Thatcher nodded. Already done. When they stepped back outside, Naomi let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. I thought it would be worse, she said. Thatcher helped her into the wagon. Sometimes folks just need reminding where their business ends. They didn't speak much on the ride home. Nellie slept in Naomi's lap, warm against her chest. The wind stung her cheeks, but she didn't mind it. Near the house, as they passed the edge of the pasture, Naomi broke the silence. Did you mean it about building on? I did. She looked at him then, long enough that he glanced back. Then I suppose we ought to draw up a plan. Thatcher laid the last board of the new room with the same steady pace he used for everything measured, exact, and quiet. Naomi watched from the kitchen doorway, Nellie in her arms, her breath fogging the glass as the afternoon light slid toward dusk. You'll want to seal the corners before the snow sets deep, she said, adjusting the baby's bonnet. He didn't glance up. Already mixed the pitch. Just letting it warm by the stove. She stepped outside and crossed the yard, her boots leaving shallow prints in the early frost. Nellie stirred, blinking up at the sharp blue sky. It's good work, she said, stopping at the edge of the porch. You could have made a trade of it. Thatcher straightened, brushing sawdust from his trousers. I used to think about it, but I never liked taking orders from men who didn't know one end of a beam from the other. You always the stubborn? He looked at her then, a streak of sunlight catching the edge of his jaw. Only when I've got reason. She shifted Nellie to her hip. And what's your reason now? Thatcher's eyes lingered on the child, then lifted to Naomi's face. You needed a room. That was enough. She didn't answer. Instead, she turned back toward the cabin, her heart thudding with a weight she hadn't named yet. That evening, the wind rose. Thatcher bolted the shutters while Naomi settled Nellie in the cradle Thatcher had built 2 nights earlier. The carved legs were rough but sturdy, the wood sanded smooth along the rail. Naomi traced one of the posts with her fingers before stepping away. I saw you reading, she said as she ladled stew into bowls. Didn't take you for the sort? He accepted the bowl, nodding his thanks. My mother taught me before I could ride. Said a man ought to feed his mind the same as his hands. She's still living? No. Passed on a few winters back. Consumption. Naomi sat across from him, her spoon idle. I lost mine 3 years ago. Fever took her before the thaw. They ate in silence after that, the kind that settled easy between 2 people who had both known loss and didn't need to dress it up with more words. Later, when Nellie woke crying, Thatcher was the first to reach her. He lifted the baby gently, cradling her against his chest as Naomi came in from the other room, startled at first. She's only fussing, he said, bouncing her lightly. Might be the draft off the wall. Naomi watched as Nellie quieted against him, her tiny hand curling around the edge of his collar. She doesn't take to many folks, Naomi said, her voice low. She's got sense, then. Naomi didn't smile, but something in her face softened. She reached out and took the baby from him, their fingers brushing just once. Tomorrow, he said, stepping back, I'll ride into the north pasture. If there's more down pine, I'll bring some back for the stove. She nodded, then glanced toward the cradle. I'll keep the fire going. He started to leave, then paused. If you ever wanted to write a letter, I've got paper. She looked at him, confused. Who would I write to? His expression didn't change. Sometimes it ain't about who. Just helps to set things down. She didn't answer, but long after he'd gone to his room, she sat by the hearth with a scrap of paper before her, the ink pot uncapped and untouched. Snow fell that night, soft and steady. The roof held firm. When morning came, the world outside was hushed under a white stillness. Naomi wrapped herself in one of Thatcher's old coats and stepped out to feed the chickens. Her fingers were stiff by the time she scattered the last of the feed, but she stood there a moment longer, watching the way the light caught the fence rails. Thatcher came out behind her, adjusting his gloves. We'll have to haul water tomorrow. Creek's freezing at the edges. I can help with that. He pulled the door closed behind him. I know. Their eyes met, and he didn't look away. You ever think, Naomi said after a breath, that maybe you were always meant to end up here? I think the trail I followed left me fewer choices than most, but I don't regret where it led. She turned toward the pasture, nodding slowly. Neither do I. Inside the house, Nellie began to cry again, sharp and sudden. Thatcher stepped aside. Go on. I'll finish here. As Naomi crossed the yard, a thought settled in her chest, unexpected, but steady. She didn't feel like a guest anymore. And the man who had taken her in didn't feel like a stranger. The snow deepened through November, heavy and wet along the roof line, until the eaves dripped slow tears of meltwater by midday. Naomi kept Nellie wrapped in layers, her cheeks red from the cabin's warmth, her fingers always reaching for the patchwork quilt Thatcher had laid across the cradle. One morning, Naomi found Thatcher at the edge of the woodpile, sharpening the blade of a draw knife with long, careful strokes. His coat was missing a button at the collar, and his breath came out white in the cold air. She stood beside him, arms crossed against the chill. The wood stacked clean enough to last till February, she said, watching the edge of the blade catch light. I like the work, he said without looking up. Keeps the mind from turning in circles. She tucked her hands deeper into her sleeves. What's it circling today? He set the knife aside and wiped his hands on the hem of his shirt. My brother wrote. Wants me to come east for spring planting. Said there's land going fallow and he could use another set of shoulders. Naomi studied his face, the way the wind had darkened the skin around his eyes. Are you thinking of going? I was, he said, glancing toward the cabin. Before. She didn't ask what before meant. She already knew. Inside, Nellie let out a short, fussy wail. Naomi turned halfway toward the door but lingered. Would you miss this place? She asked. He looked out at the pasture where the snow had settled in shallow ridges against the fence posts. Not the land, no. But there's peace here. That's hard to walk from. The next day, he took a sled out to the far ridge where a tree had come down in the last storm. Naomi stayed behind, tending to the stew and sewing a lining into the baby's mittens. When the wind dropped, she cracked the window and let in the sharp scent of pine and smoke. By the time Thatcher returned, dusk had already settled. He hauled the sled to the porch, his shoulders dusted with snow, and opened the door with his usual quiet nod. Colt's getting in through the north wall, Naomi said, rising from the hearth. I can feel it behind the cradle. I'll chink it tighter tomorrow, he replied. The winds shifted. Might bring sleet. She took the kettle off the fire and poured water into the basin. I've been thinking about spring. He lifted an eyebrow. What about it? Chickens'll start laying again. And if we cleared the patch by the creek, we could try planting beans. Maybe carrots. He leaned against the doorframe, his fingers tucked beneath his arms. You planning to stay that long? Yes, she said, steady and clear. Unless you tell me not to. He didn't speak right away. Just crossed the room, took the kettle from her hand and set it back on the iron hook above the flame. Then he turned to face her fully, his voice low. This place isn't just mine anymore. Naomi looked down, her throat tightening. I never wanted to presume. You didn't, he said. You earned it. She nodded once, and the quiet that followed felt like something settling into place, not slipping away. That night, after Nellie had drifted off, Naomi stepped out to shake snow from the laundry line. The moon hung low, catching silver on the drifts. She didn't hear the door open behind her, but she felt Thatcher's presence before he spoke. You ever think about what you'd want, if you could choose it? She turned, arms wrapped around herself. I used to, before things turned. And now, I want steadiness. I want to wake up knowing where I'll sleep that night. I want someone who doesn't flinch when things get hard. He stepped closer, the snow crunching beneath his boots. You already have that. She met his eyes then, and there was nothing uncertain in her voice. Then I want you. He didn't answer with words. Just reached out, slow and sure, and brushed his fingers along her cheek, rough skin against soft. She leaned into the touch, her eyes closing for a breath. Inside, the firelight flickered against the windows and the baby slept undisturbed. The snow kept falling, but the cold didn't bite the same. By December's second week, the snow had thickened to a quiet weight over the land, burying the fence rails and softening the roof line until the cabin looked half swallowed by the season. Naomi stood at the window, holding Nellie on her hip, watching the gray sky fold over the hills. The stove clattered with a new log, and behind her, Thatcher shook the snow from his coat and hung it by the door. You ever seen a winter hold this deep this early? She asked, shifting Nellie to her other arm. Not since I rode through Nebraska after that hard freeze in '78, he said, crouching to unlace his boots. I snapped clean through wagon spokes that year. She ran a hand over Nellie's back, her voice quiet. We'll be snowed in soon. He straightened, brushing his palms on his trousers. I laid in enough dry flour and oats to last. And we've got salt meat for weeks. Naomi nodded, then turned from the window. I've been meaning to ask. What happened to your brother? Thatcher poured water into the basin, giving her a glance. He settled near Independence. Married young. Had a son, then lost his wife to childbirth. He's a good man, but too much land and not enough help. Naomi leaned against the table, her fingers brushing the edge of the tin cup. You thinking of writing him? I already did. Told him I wouldn't be coming. She met his gaze. Because of us? He didn't hesitate. Because of you. Because I want this life now. Not the one I thought I'd go back to. She looked down at Nellie, who blinked sleepily, her eyelids heavy. I never planned on needing anyone, Naomi said. But I don't feel alone anymore. Thatcher stepped closer, and when he spoke, his voice was low. You're not. That night, after Nellie had drifted to sleep in the cradle, Naomi lit the oil lamp and placed it on the table. The soft light caught the edge of the cedar walls and made the room feel warmer than the fire alone. She stood beside the table, hands folded, watching Thatcher as he ran a whetstone along his knife. I wrote something, she said. He looked up. I took one of your pages. Set down what I remembered about my mother's last spring. Not because I wanted to remember the sorrow, but because I didn't want to forget her voice. Thatcher set the knife aside, listening. She used to hum when she peeled apples. Same song every time. I couldn't remember the words, just the sound of it. But today, while I was rocking Nellie, I heard the tune again. Clear as when I was a child. He nodded once, slow. You should keep writing. You've got a way of holding things still with it. Her eyes softened. I was hoping you'd say that. The next morning, Thatcher hitched the sled and rode out through the snow to check the fence along the south line. Naomi watched him from the doorway, Nellie bundled against her chest, one hand curled around her shawl. When his figure disappeared beyond the rise, she turned back inside and swept the hearth clean, humming softly beneath her breath. When he returned near dusk, his cheeks were wind-raw and his coat dusted with frost. He shook it off and unwound his scarf without a word, then pulled something from beneath his arm, an old tin box, the kind used for biscuits. Found this buried under the snow near the old fence post, he said, setting it on the table. Looks like it's been there years. Inside were yellowed pages, a child's drawing, and a faded photograph of a woman with her hair pinned high. Naomi picked it up gently. Someone's memory, left behind, she murmured. We could ask around. Might belong to the McGinns. Their land bordered this one back in the day. They moved off near 5 years ago, she said, tracing the edge of the paper. Still might be kin nearby. I'll ask next time I ride out. She set the photograph down and looked up at him. You always look after what others leave behind? If it's worth something. She didn't look away. And what about what's still here? He came to her slowly, deliberate as ever. That I hold on to. Naomi reached for his hand, her fingers threading with his. I never thought I'd have a place like this. Not after what I lost. I kept waiting for the ground to give way again. It won't, he said, voice steady. Not while I'm here. They stayed like that for a long while, hands joined, the firelight flickering soft across the walls. The following weeks settled into a rhythm marked by quiet hours and small joys. Naomi taught Nellie to hold a wooden spoon, her fingers gripping it with fierce determination. Thatcher carved a row of pegs for their coats by the door and built a small bench beside the hearth where Naomi could sit and read aloud from the book he'd brought back from town. On the first clear day of January, they stood outside the cabin, the snow bright beneath their boots. Naomi held Nellie close as Thatcher stepped behind her, wrapping a shawl over both their shoulders. I never asked properly, he said, his breath warm against her ear. Would you stay here with me for good? She turned slightly, just enough to meet his eyes. I already did. He kissed her then, slow and certain as snow slid from the roof above and the wind sighed through the bare pines. Nellie stirred and blinked up at them, her face framed by the shawl, and Naomi laughed, quiet and full. They married before the thaw, in a clearing behind the cabin where the snow had melted down to the dark earth. A neighbor rode out with his wife, and she stood witness while her husband spoke the words. Nellie wore a woven bonnet Thatcher had made himself, and Naomi held his hands like they were the only solid thing in the world. The garden came in slow that spring, but it came. Rows of green pushed through the soil. Naomi had turned herself, and Nellie toddled between the furrows, her laughter echoing off the ridge. Thatcher built a pen for 2 goats, and Naomi learned to churn the milk into butter with her sleeves rolled to the elbow and a song on her lips. Each night, after the baby had gone to sleep, they sat by the fire. Sometimes they spoke, sometimes they didn't, but always they were close. One evening, as the first fireflies blinked against the window glass, Naomi rested her head on Thatcher's shoulder and said, I'm not afraid anymore. He kissed her temple, his hand warming hers. You don't ever have to be. And she wasn't. Not again.